The empire did not arrive with coins first. It arrived with ledgers. Before a single Roman soldier tightened formation in Judea, before governors issued decrees or standards were raised over stone courtyards, a quieter system had already taken hold. Taxes were assessed before harvests were counted. Debts were recorded before prayers were answered. And somewhere between the temple treasury and a Roman tax office, money began to decide who had power, and who would never escape it. This is the paradox at the heart of Roman Judea. Rome ruled from hundreds of miles away, yet its grip was felt in village markets, family homes, and sacred spaces. Not through constant violence, but through systems so efficient they became invisible. Systems that turned faith into revenue, land into collateral, and obedience into a financial obligation. At first, the numbers seemed manageable. Levies here. Duties there. A familiar arrangement for an empire that prided itself on order. But beneath the surface, something far more consequential was unfolding. A financial architecture designed not just to collect wealth, but to shape behavior, suppress resistance, and make control feel inevitable. Ordinary families felt it in smaller portions of grain, in land quietly lost to debt. Local elites sensed opportunity, then unease. Roman administrators watched revenue flows with calm precision, while distant investors treated Judea as a line item, not a homeland. Journalists of the era, scribes, historians, priests, left fragmented clues that suggest they understood the danger long before Rome acknowledged it. What do you think? Could a financial system like this exist today without armies at the gates? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the hidden mechanics of global finance, past and present. Because this isn't just a story about Rome. It's about how money learns to rule. The first sign of Roman control in Judea was not bloodshed. It was accounting. When Roman forces entered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, the empire faced a choice. Judea could be crushed and occupied, or it could be absorbed quietly. Rome chose the second option. The region sat at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, linking Egypt, Arabia, and the eastern provinces. Stability mattered more than domination by force. And stability, Rome believed, was best enforced through predictable revenue. Tribute became the mechanism of obedience. Instead of direct Roman rule, client kings and local authorities remained in place, giving the illusion of autonomy. Behind that illusion, Rome imposed a fixed financial expectation. Land taxes were assessed based on projected yields, not actual harvests. Customs duties were levied on goods moving through markets and caravan routes. A census-based head tax ensured that even survival carried a cost. Individually, each tax appeared manageable. Together, they formed a layered burden that shifted all risk onto the population. Rome demanded its share regardless of drought, disease, or price collapse. When conditions worsened, villages absorbed the loss. The empire did not. From Rome's perspective, the system worked. Reports showed steady inflows of silver and grain. Administrators tracked compliance from desks rather than battlefields. Investors saw Judea as reliable, not rebellious. Order, at least on paper, appeared complete. But beneath the numbers, pressure was quietly accumulating. That pressure revealed itself first in land. Small farmers, unable to meet tax deadlines during poor seasons, turned to borrowing. Loans were extended by local elites, often those closely aligned with Roman authority. Missed payments became liens. Liens became forfeitures. Over time, land that had sustained families for generations slipped into fewer hands, consolidating wealth and power upward. Rome did not need to seize property directly. The financial structure did the work for them. At the same time, the empire preserved Judea's most sacred institution, the temple. Publicly, This was framed as respect for tradition. Privately, it was a financial masterstroke. Temple taxes, once primarily religious, became economically central. Pilgrimage seasons flooded Jerusalem with foreign currencies, requiring exchange into Roman-approved coinage. Each exchange carried a fee. Every act of devotion now moved money through Roman-sanctioned channels. Money changers prospered. Intermediaries thrived. Ordinary worshippers paid more than they realized. Priests noticed the shift. So did local scholars and chroniclers. Authority no longer announced itself through force. It arrived as obligation. Control no longer marched in formation. It settled into routine. To Rome, the numbers still looked stable. To the people, life felt increasingly narrow. Choices disappeared quietly. Resistance had not yet erupted, but resentment was no longer abstract. The system was holding. The people were not. For years, Rome mistook silence for stability. On the surface, Judea appeared compliant. Taxes continued to flow. Markets opened each morning. Pilgrims still crowded the streets of Jerusalem during festival seasons. To Roman administrators reviewing reports from afar, the province looked financially sound, low cost, steady return, minimal military presence required. But inside Judea, the system was tightening. Debt was no longer an emergency measure. It had become a condition of survival. Families borrowed not to expand or invest, but simply to remain solvent under overlapping obligations. Land taxes, temple dues, customs fees, each arrived on its own schedule, indifferent to household reality. Missing one payment triggered penalties that cascaded into the next. Lenders understood the leverage this created. Interest rates rose quietly. Contracts became less forgiving. Land was accepted as collateral because it was reliable and irreversible. Each default transferred more productive land into elite hands, shrinking the economic independence of the majority. Faith, too, was becoming entangled with finance. The temple treasury grew, but so did its political sensitivity. Roman officials understood that religious unrest was dangerous, yet they also recognized the temple's economic gravity. By allowing temple authorities to manage collections while enforcing Roman expectations behind the scenes, the empire converted spiritual obligation into fiscal infrastructure. Economists of the era, scribes, philosophers, provincial historians, began recording unease. They described a society where work no longer guaranteed security, where obedience no longer ensured relief. Journalists of their time wrote in careful language, aware of the risk, but their meaning was clear: pressure was being applied unevenly, and it was intensifying. Still, Rome saw efficiency. The empire had mastered extraction without occupation. What it underestimated was what prolonged financial pressure does to people who feel they have nothing left to lose. The moment the wider world began to notice came not from rebellion, but from disruption. Trade slowed. Caravans arriving from Judea carried less surplus than expected. Grain shipments fluctuated. Tax forecasts became harder to predict. In Rome, analysts compared reports and noticed irregularities that numbers alone could not explain. Something was interfering with productivity. Investors grew cautious. Judea was still profitable, but no longer boring. And in imperial finance, boredom was safety. Local authorities responded by tightening enforcement. Collections became more aggressive. Asset seizures increased. Public auctions of land, once rare, became familiar. For ordinary citizens, the shift felt sudden, even though it had been years in the making. The system that once seemed tolerable now felt inescapable. Foreign markets reacted subtly. Traders rerouted goods. Credit terms hardened. Confidence thinned. No panic yet, but concern was spreading quietly. the way it does before headlines change. Roman officials debated responses. Military intervention was costly and politically risky. Reform threatened precedent. The empire had built its reputation on consistency. Changing the rules for Judea would invite questions elsewhere. So Rome waited. And waiting, in this case, allowed tension to mature. By the time unrest finally surfaced, through protests, refusal to pay, symbolic acts of defiance, it was no longer about tax rates or coinage. It was about dignity. About survival. About a system that had turned daily life into a ledger entry. The empire had achieved financial control. But control was starting to crack. By the time Rome recognized the depth of what it had built in Judea, the system was already revealing its limits. Financial control had delivered revenue, but it had also altered the social fabric. Villages once organized around shared land and seasonal rhythms were now defined by obligations and arrears. Economic life narrowed. Risk pooled at the bottom, while insulation accumulated at the top. The system was efficient, but emotionally brittle. Ordinary citizens internalized the pressure first. For many families, the future no longer felt expandable. Decisions were made defensively. Marriages were delayed. Investments avoided. Faith, once a source of hope, became complicated by cost. Even prayer carried a transactional undertone. Not because belief had faded, but because survival now demanded calculation. Observers noted the change in tone. Markets sounded quieter. Conversations shortened. Productivity declined in ways that spreadsheets could not fully explain. Rome had extracted stability, but it had also drained initiative. A society under constant financial compression does not innovate. It endures. Foreign analysts looking back later would recognize the pattern. Extraction systems often peak just before they fail, not because revenue disappears overnight, but because trust does. Judea had become governable, but not resilient. Rome's administrators debated the situation in abstract terms. Adjustments were discussed. Thresholds recalculated. But the core architecture remained untouched. The empire had optimized for control, not cohesion. And cohesion, once lost, is rarely restored through policy. The question was no longer whether the system worked. It was how long people would tolerate it. History remembers the unrest that followed, but it often misses the quieter lesson beneath it. Rome did not lose Judea because it lacked power. It lost it because financial domination carries a delayed cost. Systems that prioritize extraction over participation eventually erode the very base they depend on. What begins as efficient governance can harden into permanent fragility. In Judea, money had replaced the sword, but the effect was the same. Control felt distant, unavoidable, and impersonal. And when people cannot see a path forward, they stop believing the system is meant to include them at all. The lasting truth is not about Rome's fall, or Judea's resistance. It is about design. Financial systems shape behavior long before they provoke reaction. They teach people what is possible, what is permitted, and what is hopeless. Modern economists would recognize the warning signs instantly: concentrated risk, inflexible extraction, misaligned incentives. But those signs only appear obvious in retrospect. To Rome, Judea was a success story, until it wasn't. The empire learned, too late, that money can govern quietly, but it cannot command loyalty forever. And that may be the most enduring legacy of Rome's financial system in Judea. Not the revenue it generated, but the trust it consumed. In the end, the Roman system in Judea reminds us that power rarely announces itself at first. It arrives in procedures, in obligations, in numbers that seem reasonable until they are unavoidable. Empires, corporations, and governments often believe that if the spreadsheets balance, the system is working. But history suggests something quieter and more dangerous, that when financial systems stop serving the people beneath them, they may still function perfectly, right up until the moment they fail. The global economy today feels far removed from ancient Judea. Yet the mechanics are familiar. Debt, taxation, intermediaries, and distant decision-makers still shape lives from afar. The lesson Rome left behind is not about conquest, but about design. Money can organize societies. It can stabilize them. But when control replaces participation, the cost is eventually paid in ways no ledger can predict. If stories like this change the way you see the world, stay with us. Because the most powerful forces in finance are often the ones we stop noticing, until they begin to break.